one of the very few books that I recommend on a regular basis. This is not necessarily your starting book, but if you want a lot, I mean, I'm talking lots. How big is this book? 500 pages, 600 pages, almost as many pages as the Bible, but actually useful pages of information, data, charts, tables, graphs on all kinds of different investments and how things work. This is a fantastic book. Once again, the name Common Sense on Mutual Funds, John C. Bogle. I often refer to this as my Bible. So in this book, very early on, he actually talks about the returns of several different asset classes. It includes stocks, bonds, gold is one of the things. And what you end up with is if you invest for, based on 200 years of data from 1802 until, I think this is 2008, so it's about 206 years. If you had invested $10,000 in gold, the initial investment of $10,000, your eventual return, your real return, which is your return after inflation. So nominal returns, or what I normally talk about are actual returns, can be adjusted down by inflation. So if you make 10% and inflation that year was 3%, you made a real return of 7. So that's what we're talking about here. The gold went from $10,000 to 200 years later went to $26,000. So up 2.6 times, 10,000 to 26,000. Bonds collectively went from 10,000 to 8 million over 206 years. And stocks went from 10,000 to 5.6 billion with a B, $5.6 billion. That's a very big difference. That's why the show stresses, why I stress time and time again, if you're a long-term investor, stocks is the one and only place to be. Now, when you get to short-term, 10 or 12 years from retirement or from needing to or wanting to spend part of that money, it changes things. And that's a whole different segment we've talked about before and we'll talk about again. But in the long run, you're a long-run investor. Stocks are the place to be. And just today I was talking to someone who was 60 years old, and they wanted to try to convince me that they're not a long-term investor anymore. And we talked about their family, and a lot of people in their family have lived past the age of 90. So if you think there's a chance that you're going to live past the age of 90 and you're 60, that's more than 30 years. You are still a long-term investor. If you have assets that you intend to leave to a spouse or to kids or to some charity, you are a long-term investor. If you happen to know that you have stage 4 lung cancer and your chances of living past 5 years are, 2 or 3%, all right, now you've convinced me. You are a short-term investor. You don't want fluctuations, and you want to take the money out and spend it if that's what you choose to do, because you're not going to live very long, or at least the odds aren't in your favor. So that's the return of gold. It's this incredibly small return, but from time to time, like in the 80s and even a few years ago, you can have these giant swings. And so the argument is that, if you do that, well, if you happen to know when the bottom is and if you happen to know when the top is, sure, you could have made a lot of money in gold. I can do that in stocks too. Well, I can claim that in stocks. I can't do it. I don't have any knowledge on how to do that. And I'm long taken the position that people that claim to have that ability are simply claiming to have the ability and actually don't have the ability. And now I'm going to read a quote from John Bogle, again in this book on page 13. This is the 10th anniversary edition, in case you happen to have the original. That might be in a different... This won't be in there, so you have to have the revised, updated edition, which is really nice because what he did when he updated the book, it has all the original content, and then at the end of each section, or almost every section, there's, in a shaded area, an update for that section, where he goes over what he got right and what he got wrong, which is how we should look at things, because we're all human, we make mistakes. But here's his quote. Gold is largely a rank speculation, for its price is based solely on market expectation. Gold provides no internal rate of return. Unlike stocks and bonds, gold provides none of the intrinsic value that is created for stocks by earning growth and dividend yields, and for bonds by interest payments. So in the last 2 centuries plus, shown in the chart, I was telling you about the results from the chart, by the way. We go back to the quote. Quote, the initial 10,000 investment of gold grew to barely 26,000 in real terms. So I'd really love the thing that we called it rank speculation. That's why I do not invest in gold. That's why I do not recommend investing in gold. In the long run, it doesn't make money. And quite frankly, I think the phrase hedge against inflation is one of the best marketing gimmicks ever. Because what they'll tell you is that a hedge against inflation means, the one I've heard is that, a certain amount of gold will buy you a suit today, and it would have bought you a suit 20 years ago, and it would have bought you a suit 1,000 years ago. Great. If you want to keep pace with inflation, about 3% in the United States, then gold might be okay if you ignore all the short-term fluctuations. In the long run, you might be able to make 3%. I'd rather make 10% in the long run, not 3%. I don't want to match inflation. I want to beat it. I want to grow wealth, not just keep what I have and stand still or, a slow walk on a treadmill. That's not why I invest. But if you have different goals, maybe it's right for you. So that will end my snark, and that ends the segment on gold. And now we're just going to go into our interview about financial law and the new pending fiduciary rule. This is Phil Ferguson with Polaris Financial Planning, the home of science-based investing. I see people owning really bad investments all of the time. Many advisors are paid a commission by a big company to sell you something you may not need. It's kind of like church. They create fear, then they tell you what you want to hear, and then they take your money. What you want is an advisor that is paid only by you. That is a fee-only fiduciary advisor. Remember, people work for who they are paid by. You can contact me, Phil, at PolarisFinancialPlanning.com, or listen to the cleverly titled The Phil Ferguson Show. Each show, we have an interesting investing skeptically topic and an interview with someone fighting to end religion. Polaris also gives 10% of gross revenue to support the growing secular movement. You're not just getting better investments, you're helping to change the world. All right, everybody, welcome back. This is Phil Ferguson, and of course, this is the Phil Ferguson Show. Today, we've got, a very informative, interesting, and perhaps odd interview. We are going to talk to a legal scholar. He is an expert in financial law, and specifically in ERISA law, and we'll talk about that. But because of the work that he does, we're only going to use a code name, and it's just going to be a couple of letters. We're going to call him WB. WB, are you there today?
I am. It's a pleasure to be here, Phil.
Now, you mentioned before in the pre-show that you're concerned about your identity becoming known. Why is that? Talk to me.
Well, I am a lawyer, and the legal profession is of the most conservative And how you get business in the law is through word of mouth and other practitioners. Now, if somebody doesn't like you because, say, you don't believe in the same sky fairy that they do, then they may be happy to go and tattletale and tell someone else, and that may adversely affect your career, and that's not what I'm looking for.
So I just want to make sure that I understood this correctly, and I think that I do. You're concerned that you might actually lose business if people find out not only that you're a non-believer, but you're on this show.
Absolutely. Okay. I'm not important enough to lose business. I could lose my job.
Yeah, so we definitely don't want that. So, it's one of those things that I would rather use your name, but, I've got to work with what you're comfortable with. So we're going to do that. Now, what is your background in law? What do you have a degree? And if you don't want to mention the state it's from, I understand, but, tell me a little bit about your background.
So I have a normal JD. I got that from a top 25 school. And when I was there, I also happened to get a tax degree as well, which is a master's of law as an LLM. And I was lucky enough to get that for free because I just had to increase my suffering level a little bit while I was there and do some summer classes.
Great. And so now you practice financial law. What does that mean? What does financial law mean?
So I do a little bit of everything. I do some corporate law. I do a little bit of tax law. I do an awful lot of ERISA law, which is the Employee Retirement Income Securities Act. And I also do some executive compensation, where the big wigs want to make their own plan for their retirement.
And you threw out something that I've thrown out before. That's ERISA, and you gave it the full name, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, and it's from 1974. And I'm assuming, like anything and everything from the government, it's complicated and convoluted, and you really have to spend time studying it to understand what it says.
So there's a premium for attorneys that do ERISA law. There's a premium for attorneys that do tax law. I do both, and it's doing well for me. Yeah, it's rather long. It's hundreds of pages, and it's unpleasant, to be honest.
And so you're making your living off a couple hundred pages of text because it's complicated.
Right, because nobody else wants to do it, because it's just somewhat miserable, and the stakes are rather high. If you mess up in ERISA and you don't catch it for 6 months, then you could be looking at $100,000, and your malpractice carrier is not going to be happy if you come to them and let them know that you've got a $100,000 problem.
So now we've got the title, ERISA, but in English, what does ERISA cover? What does it apply to?
Oh, it's your 401k account.
And only 401ks? Or? What else does it cover besides 401k?
It covers most retirement stuff. So 401ks are rather complicated critters. There is the account side, and then the far more complicated side is going to be the employer side, where they have to hatch the plan and have the trust account and the fiduciary and all of that. And so that's going to be 3/4 of the however many pages
right.
ERISA is.
And so does it cover a 403b?
It sure does. Absolutely.
How about, 457?
It does.
Deferred compensation, a pension plan?
Yes.
So
yes, absolutely.
Pretty much anything that you get money from an employer, almost in any way that's not just income, ERISA is going to cover.
Right. If you do your services for your employer in 1 year, and then they compensate you 75 days after that year ends, you're doing deferred compensation. And so all of that falls under ERISA law.
Okay. So that's the area of specialty, and we know it's complicated. I know all the time. What kind of problems do employers run into when they have a 401k?
So 401ks are complicated critters. They were written by folks like me that have law degrees. They were made in such a way that they're decentralized. And so you have all of these different employers that have this complicated piece of legislature that they're trying to get correct. Unfortunately, a lot of employers just don't know how it works. They read the language and give it a good faith effort, and then they go in and try to implement it, and they forget something. They don't know what a particular phrase means. There's a lot of deadlines. There's a lot of math. There's a lot of accounting, and it's easy to mess it up. And hiring me is not cheap, unfortunately. And so folks have to either pay me or preferably a third party, or they can try to do it themselves. And if they try to do it themselves and get audited, then oftentimes the fees are astronomical.
Now, how big a fee are we talking about here?
I had one recently within the past 3 months that he was looking at $76,000.
Okay, that's real money.
That's real money. And I think that employer maybe had 200 employees. They couldn't afford it.
Yeah, so that's a bad thing. Now, it's one of those things that I deal with these sometimes, talk to employees that have them. What is the top-heavy test? Can you tell me about that?
I don't know the top-heavy test right off the top of my head, but
general.
it's...
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Go ahead and give me in general.
So it's where you're